The producer's hands were shaking as he pressed the record button one last time. What happened in the next 3 minutes would either save a troubled movie soundtrack or become the most expensive recording session failure in Hollywood history. Nobody in that studio knew they were about to witness the single greatest vocal performance ever captured on tape. It was May 1992 at Capitol Studios in Hollywood. The Bodyguard movie was in serious trouble. Kevin Costner's passion project had gone over budget. The chemistry between him and Whitney Houston was being questioned by executives, and the soundtrack needed a signature song that could justify Whitney's massive casting fee. The pressure was crushing everyone in that building. But Whitney Houston didn't know any of this as she walked into Studio A that Tuesday morning. She thought she was just laying down a simple country ballad for a movie scene. She had no idea this song would define her entire career and change power ballads forever. David Foster, the legendary producer, had been working with Whitney for 3 days trying to get the perfect take of "I Will Always Love You." Originally written and recorded by Dolly Parton in 1974, the song was a gentle country goodbye. But Kevin Costner had a vision. He wanted Whitney to transform it into something bigger, something that matched the epic romance of his film. The first 2 days had been frustrating for everyone. Whitney kept delivering technically perfect takes, but something was missing. David could hear it. The notes were right, the timing was flawless, but the emotion felt controlled, professional, safe. He needed her to go somewhere deeper, somewhere vulnerable. During breaks, David would watch Whitney retreat into herself. She'd sit alone in the corner of the studio, staring at the lyrics, occasionally wiping her eyes. He didn't know what pain she was processing, what memories the words were triggering, but he could sense something was building inside her. "Whitney, we need magic," David told her during their first session. "Dolly's version is beautiful, but we need you to make people believe in love again." Whitney looked exhausted. She'd been filming for 12 hours a day, learning to act while also being expected to deliver vocal perfection. "David, I'm tired," she admitted. "My voice feels heavy. Maybe we should try this another day." But there was no other day. The movie was wrapping in 2 weeks, and this song needed to be finished. David made a decision that would change everything. "Let's just try one more take. No pressure. Just sing it like you're talking to someone you love, someone you have to let go." What David didn't know was that Whitney was already thinking about someone. Her relationship with her best friend Robin Crawford was complicated, filled with love that couldn't be fully expressed in public. Choices that tore at her heart every single day. When Whitney closed her eyes to sing "I Will Always Love You," she wasn't thinking about a movie. She was thinking about real goodbye, real loss, real love that society said she couldn't have. The studio musicians took their positions. Sound engineer Mike Moran adjusted the microphone levels. David Foster sat at the control board, his finger hovering over the record button. Everyone was tense. This was the 14th take in 3 days. If it didn't work now, the song would be cut from the movie. Whitney stood alone in the isolation booth, headphones on, eyes closed. For a moment, she looked vulnerable in a way the powerful Whitney Houston never showed in public. David gave her the signal. The piano introduction began to play, and then something extraordinary happened. Whitney started singing a cappella, no instruments, no backing track, just her voice, naked and pure, delivering the opening lines with a vulnerability that made everyone in the studio stop breathing. "If I should stay, I would only be in your way." Mike Moran's eyes widened. This was different from every other take. The pain in Whitney's voice was real. David Foster leaned forward, sensing something special was happening. Nobody moved. Nobody dared make a sound. When the full instrumental arrangement kicked in and Whitney began building the song's intensity, the engineers started looking at each other with expressions of disbelief. Her voice was doing things they'd never heard before. She wasn't just singing the lyrics, she was living them. Every note carried weight, emotion, experience that went beyond technical perfection into something almost spiritual. But then came the moment nobody was prepared for, the final chorus, the part where the song was supposed to end with a simple, elegant finish. Whitney had other plans. As the music swelled beneath her, Whitney took a breath and launched into an improvisation that wasn't in the sheet music, wasn't discussed with David, wasn't planned by anyone. And I will always love you. Ow, ooh, ooh. The sustained run that came out of Whitney's mouth was not human. It couldn't be human. The note started in one register and climbed and climbed and climbed until it seemed to pierce through the ceiling of the studio, through the roof of the building, straight up into the heavens. The power behind it was like a tidal wave. The control behind it was like a surgeon's precision. The emotion behind it was like every heartbreak in history channeled through one woman's voice. David Foster's jaw literally dropped. He'd produced everyone from Barbra Streisand to Celine Dion. He'd worked with every great vocalist of the past 2 decades. He'd never heard anything like what was coming through those speakers. Mike Moran forgot to monitor the levels. He just sat there, frozen, as tears started streaming down his face. Later, he would say he couldn't explain why he was crying. The sound was just so beautiful, it bypassed his brain and went straight to his soul. The studio musicians stopped playing. Not because they were supposed to, they just couldn't focus on their instruments while that voice was filling the room. The guitarist's hands were trembling. The drummer had goosebumps covering his entire body. The bass player would later describe it as, "the moment I understood what people mean when they talk about God." And Whitney just kept singing. She held that impossible note for what felt like forever, but was actually 7 seconds of sustained power that should have been physically impossible. Her eyes were still closed. She had no idea what was happening in the control room. She was somewhere else entirely, in a place of pure emotion, pure release, pure truth. When the song finally ended and Whitney opened her eyes, the studio was completely silent. Not the usual silence of people waiting to see what happens next. This was the silence of people who just witnessed something sacred and didn't have words for what they'd experienced. Whitney took off her headphones, confused by the lack of response. "Was that okay?" she asked through the talkback microphone. "Should we try it again?" David Foster couldn't speak. He literally could not form words. He just shook his head slowly, tears visible on his face. Mike Moran was openly crying now, not even trying to hide it. One of the session musicians had walked out of the room because he was overwhelmed. Finally, David found his voice. It came out as a whisper. "Whitney, come listen to this." When Whitney walked into the control room and heard the playback, even she was shocked. "That's me?" she asked, almost not believing it. "I did that?" The performance was so powerful that Whitney herself didn't recognize the sound coming from her own body. It was as if she'd channeled something beyond her normal abilities, accessed a place in her voice that even she didn't know existed. David made a decision right there. "That's the take. We're done. Don't touch it. Don't change it. That's going in the movie exactly as it is." But here's what makes this story even more incredible. What nobody in that studio knew was that Dolly Parton, the woman who wrote the song, was about to hear Whitney's version for the first time, and her reaction would prove just how special that studio moment really was. 2 weeks later, someone from the movie studio called Dolly Parton to get her approval for Whitney's rendition. This was a professional courtesy. Dolly still owned the publishing rights, and her blessing would be important for the song's success. Dolly was in her tour bus when she first heard the recording. Her manager played it over the phone while she listened on a small speaker. The sound quality was terrible, just a rough mix over a phone line. But that didn't matter. When Whitney's voice hit that final climactic run, Dolly Parton burst into tears. Not polite tears, deep, body-shaking sobs that she couldn't control. Her manager was alarmed, thinking something was wrong. "Dolly, are you okay? Do you hate it? We can tell them no." Dolly couldn't speak for a full minute. When she finally composed herself enough to talk, her voice was thick with emotion. "That's the most beautiful thing I've ever heard. She didn't just sing my song, she made it her own. She made it better than I ever could have imagined." Later, Dolly would tell an interviewer, "When I heard Whitney's version, I cried. I had to pull my car over because I was crying so hard. It's overwhelming to hear someone take something you've created and elevate it to a place you never imagined it could go. Whitney took my little country song and made it immortal." What Dolly didn't share publicly at the time was how personal that moment was for her. She'd written "I Will Always Love You" about leaving her mentor, Porter Wagoner, a painful professional divorce that had broken her heart. Hearing Whitney sing it with such raw emotion reminded Dolly of her own sacrifice, her own difficult goodbye to someone she loved. It was like Whitney had reached across time and understood exactly what Dolly had felt when she first wrote those words in 1973. Dolly called Whitney personally after that first listen. "Baby, you just gave my song eternal life," she told her. Whitney, characteristically humble, tried to deflect the praise. But Dolly insisted, "No, you need to understand what you did. You didn't just sing my song well. You made it mean something new. You made it yours while honoring what I created. That's a gift most artists never achieve." But the story doesn't end there, because what happened next proved that Whitney's performance wasn't just beautiful. It was transformative in ways nobody could have predicted. When I Will Always Love You was released as a single in November 1992, it didn't just become a hit, it became a phenomenon. The song debuted at #1 and stayed there for 14 weeks. In an era when most songs were lucky to have 1 week at the top, Whitney's performance was so powerful that nothing could dislodge it from the charts. Radio stations reported their phone lines would light up with callers who just wanted to talk about what they'd heard. Some were crying, some just wanted to share what the song made them feel. Music critics, who'd spent years analyzing vocal technique, struggled to find words to describe what Whitney had done. "There are technically perfect singers and there are emotionally powerful singers," one review stated. "Whitney Houston is both simultaneously, and that combination is so rare, it's almost unfair to other artists." The song won the Grammy for Record of the Year. The Bodyguard soundtrack became the best-selling soundtrack of all time. Whitney's performance became the gold standard against which every power ballad would be measured for the next 3 decades. But the most profound impact was something nobody could have predicted. That recording session, that single take, that improvised climax that Whitney hadn't planned, it changed how the music industry thought about vocal performance. Before Whitney's I Will Always Love You, singers were expected to stick to the arrangement, hit the notes as written, deliver the song as the songwriter intended. After Whitney, everyone understood that the greatest performances come when an artist transcends the material and creates something entirely new. Young singers growing up in the 1990s would listen to Whitney's version on repeat, trying to understand how she did it. Vocal coaches would use the recording to demonstrate what's possible when technique meets emotion. Karaoke bars would cringe every time someone attempted the song, because nobody could do what Whitney did that day in Studio A. David Foster would always say that Whitney's performance was the single greatest moment he'd witnessed in a studio. "I've been in rooms with genius before," he explained years later, "but what Whitney did that day wasn't genius. It was divinity." Mike Moran, the sound engineer, kept the original tape from that session in a fireproof safe. He said it captured a moment when a human being achieved perfection. "I've recorded thousands of songs," he said, "but that was the only time I felt like I was witnessing a miracle." The studio musicians who played on the track all reported the same strange phenomenon. Years later, they'd find themselves comparing everything to that moment with Whitney. Nothing ever measured up. "It ruined me in a way," one of them admitted, "because I spent the rest of my career chasing the feeling of being in that room when Whitney hit that note. And I never found it again." But perhaps the most touching part of this story is what happened between Whitney Houston and Dolly Parton after that recording changed both their lives. The two women developed a deep friendship based on mutual respect and love. Dolly would publicly credit Whitney's version with introducing her songwriting to a whole new generation. Whitney would always acknowledge that without Dolly's beautiful composition, she'd have had nothing to interpret. "Dolly wrote the truth," Whitney said in an interview. "All I did was feel it and let it out. She gave me the gift of those words, those melodies, that emotion. I just opened my mouth and let what was already there come through." In 2012, when Whitney Houston tragically passed away, Dolly Parton released a statement that brought many people to tears. "I will always love Whitney," she wrote. "She took my song and made it a masterpiece. She gave it wings, and now she has wings of her own." The recording session that happened that day in May 1992 was supposed to be routine. A movie needed a song. A producer needed a take. An actress-singer needed to fulfill her contract. But what actually happened was something far more profound. For 3 minutes and 32 seconds, Whitney Houston achieved what every artist dreams of. She created something perfect, something timeless, something that would outlive her and continue to move people long after she was gone. Today, I Will Always Love You has been streamed over 1 billion times. It's been covered by thousands of artists. It's been sung at weddings, funerals, graduations, and moments of profound personal significance all over the world. But none of those versions, no matter how talented the singer, ever comes close to what Whitney did that day. Because what happened in Studio A wasn't about technique, though Whitney's technique was flawless. It wasn't about power, though the power in her voice was unprecedented. It was about truth. In that moment, Whitney Houston was completely, vulnerably, impossibly honest. She sang about love and loss with such raw authenticity that everyone who heard it felt like she was singing directly to them about their own heartbreak. The producer's hands were shaking when he pressed record that final time. But it was Whitney Houston's voice that shook the world. And that studio going silent, that wasn't just shock or awe. That was recognition. Everyone in that room understood they just witnessed something that happens maybe once in a generation, if we're lucky. The moment when talent, emotion, and timing align perfectly to create not just a great recording, but a piece of musical history that would define excellence for decades to come. Whitney Houston hit that note. The studio went silent. Dolly Parton cried, and music was never the same again. If this story touched your heart, please subscribe and share it with someone who needs to hear about the power of authentic emotion. Drop a comment telling us your favorite Whitney Houston memory, and hit that notification bell for more untold stories from music's greatest moments.